Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about time travel, one of my favorite topics, and we've been doing videos before this leading up to this, but if this is the first video that you're watching from this sort of loose series, that's okay. You don't have to have watched the other one to understand this one. So don't think that you have to now go back and watch all the other ones. That's it's totally fine. You don't have to. Every video stands independently of every other video, but these all do come from my book, Quantum Creation: Does the Supernatural Lurk in the Fourth Dimension? And for that book, Dr. Ronald Mallett, a brilliant guy, he was nice enough to give me an interview over the phone, actually, for this book, which was transcribed, and I'm going to play that interview in the video here. So what we've been looking at quantum physics so far, and our study has brought us to a really interesting question: is there a way to reverse entropy? And for those of you who are new to the idea of entropy, basically that's just from order to disorder. It's cause and effect. It's degradation. It's things break down. Is there a way to reverse entropy without creating even more entropy somewhere else? Now, there are a few theoretical answers to this question, but it really boils down to one point. With the current direction of the arrow of time from past to future, entropy just simply cannot be decreased. It would seem the only way to reverse entropy would be to travel back to a time when entropy was lower, when there wasn't as much disorder or chaos. But can such a thing even be done? Is time travel a feasible possibility? And if so, are there ethical and theological problems to consider? Now, of course, in doing a video such as this, discussion about potential time travel just simply cannot be avoided. And because this topic is so vast, I thought it would be best to consult an actual expert. So I'm going to play this interview with Dr. Ronald Mallett. For those of you who aren't familiar with him or his work, he's a theoretical physicist, academic, and author of the book Time Traveler: A Scientist's Personal Mission to Make Time Travel a Reality. An absolutely phenomenal book. I highly suggest checking it out. He has been a professor at the University of Connecticut since 1975. Dr. Mallett is most known for his research into time travel. So for help, and you might have seen him on different documentaries and news shows and news reports and things like that. He's very active in the media, which is great. So for help in sorting out all the possibilities, I contacted Dr. Ronald Mallett, a physicist, and I'll say he's also a fellow believer. He's a Christian, so he has an interesting perspective on how this might work, or some of the possible things that could come up if there are theological problems or ethical issues. But I contacted him for an interview regarding some of his research into the issue of time travel. So again, this interview, It's the actual recording that I'm going to play, and the whole interview is transcribed in my book, Quantum Creation. And if you want to check that out, you can look at the link in the description below, or just go to sharpeningreport.com. Okay, so check this out.
Well, I guess first question, how did you become interested in the study of time?
Yeah, well, the reason I became interested in time travel had to do with a tragedy that happened in my family, my early life. When I was 10 years old, my father, who was really the center of my life, I was the oldest of 4 children, and I grew up in the Bronx, New York, and my father was a television repairman in the Bronx, and he was very good at what he did, and he looked like he was very healthy, and even though he worked very hard, he had time for the family. I mean, he spent a lot of time answering questions, and he gave me toys like gyroscope and crystal radio set, and as I said, I really adored him. And we didn't know that he had a weak heart, and he died completely suddenly of a massive heart attack, and he was only 33 years old. And it really shook my world. I mean, it really turned my world upside down. And I went from being a happy kid to a rather depressed kid. But one of the gifts that he left me, among other things, I should mention, incidentally, that after he died, the family plunged into poverty. So it was a very, very difficult time, and I don't know how my mother survived it. I think it was her religious faith that helped her to survive. But the thing is that about a year after he died, I came across a book that changed my life. It was called The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. It was actually what's known as a Classics Illustrated version of it. And the book, right at the very beginning, it said that scientific people know very well that time is just a kind of space, and we can move forward and backward in time just as we can in space. When I read that, I knew that this was the thing that could save me. This would be my lifeline, because I thought if I could build a time machine, I could go back and see my father again and tell him what was going to happen and be with him, but, maybe I could figure out some way to prevent it from happening. So that became my mission, and it was actually a secret mission because, even at the age of 11, I knew that people were already worried about me, so I didn't tell people what I was interested in doing. But that was the beginning. And about a year after that, when I was about 12, I came across the second book that changed my life. As I mentioned, we were quite poor after my father died, and I had this very serious book habit. I had to read, and the only books that I could afford were at the Salvation Army. You could pick up paperbacks for like 5 cents. And one time when I went in there, I saw the cover of this paperback. It had a picture of Einstein on it. And next to Einstein was an hourglass. And I knew, I didn't know what Einstein did, but I knew that he was this great genius. Incidentally, as a side issue, Einstein died exactly in the same year that my father died, in 1955. And that's always been an interesting coincidence for me.
Oh, wow.
But the thing is that even though I didn't understand, as I said, the cover of the book, of the paperback, told me that there must be a relationship between Einstein and time, because it had Einstein standing next to an hourglass. So I bought the book, and even though I couldn't understand everything that was in it, I did get the gist of it. It said that Einstein said that time was not something that was absolute. In ordinary classical physics of Newton, you can't do anything to change time. But in the physics of Einstein, you can change time. And Einstein said that there were ways that time could be changed. So I knew that if I could understand Einstein, then that would be the key. And I remember the book. I still remember the name of it. It was called The Universe and Dr. Einstein by a man named Lincoln Burnett. And the thing is that that was the beginning of my desire to understand Einstein. Now, it didn't just go simply from A to Z. That is to say, I didn't just simply go from that to graduating and then going to college. In fact, we were too poor for me to go to college. So after I got out of high school, I joined the Air Force as an enlisted man during the Vietnam War period. And I used the GI Bill when I got out to go to Penn State. And that's where I made my specialty in Einstein's work, his special and general theory of relativity. And that was what was the beginning. I mean, and the thing is that I eventually understood that Einstein had developed two theories. One of the theory was called the special theory of relativity, which he developed in 1905. And that theory, in a nutshell, said that time can be changed by motion. That is to say that the faster an object moves, the more time will slow down for that object. So time for a moving clock will actually slow down. That's essentially the essence of Einstein's special theory of relativity. And it turns out that there are experiments that have been done that actually show that time can be slowed down by a moving clock. In fact, one was done that most people don't know about, was done in 1971 at the Naval Observatory. What they did was to take two atomic clocks, and one of the atomic clocks was kept at rest at the Naval Observatory, and the other one was put on a moving plane. The plane was traveling close to the speed of sound, and when they brought the plane back, they found that the clock that had been on the plane had actually slowed down. Now, it was only by fractions of a second, but it did show that exactly as Einstein predicted, time slows down. The effect actually becomes greater the faster you move. So close to the speed of light, then it isn't just in terms of fractions of a second, it's in terms of hours, and, it's appreciable. In fact, there's a device called the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Geneva, Switzerland, and what they do is they have subatomic particles that they can accelerate close to the speed of light. And some of these particles normally only live for a millionth of a second, and what they can do is by accelerating these particles close to the speed of light, they can get these particles to live 10 times longer than they normally would. And if we did that to human beings, that would mean that a human being traveling close to the speed of light, remember when I'm talking about a clock, I'm not talking about just a mechanical mechanism. Your heart is a clock. That means that your heart rate would actually slow down. You would actually age less than other people. And this means that if you were traveling fast enough, you could go, for you, time might, only a few years might pass, but if you were traveling fast enough, decades could be passing for everyone else, and you could wind up literally in the future only being a few years older, whereas here on Earth, decades have passed. So that's essentially time travel into the future, by the way, is by speed. So one way of altering time is by using speed. But that just carries you into the future. And, of course, I was interested in going into the past. And that turns out not to be possible in a special theory of relativity. No matter how fast you go, number one, you can't go faster than the speed of light. And number two, you can't travel back into the past, no matter how fast you go. So you can't do that with his theory, but the special theory. It turned out that about 10 years after that, Einstein developed a second theory that was called the general theory of relativity. This theory has to do with the fact that gravity can affect time. That essentially is the essence of it. That is to say that for Einstein was able to show, and he did this mathematically. I should mention, whenever I say Einstein showed, I should mention that when I use that phrase, I mean that Einstein used mathematical equations to show these things. Einstein didn't do the experiments to do that. Those experiments were done later by experimental physicists. Einstein was a theoretical physicist. But his equations predicted. And what he said was that the stronger gravity is, the more time will slow down. So, for example, gravity here at the surface of the Earth is stronger than gravity at a high altitude. So gravity clocks should actually slow down or run slower here at the surface of the Earth than they do at high altitudes. And once again, that's been shown to be so experimentally. One of the, in fact, most dramatic representations of that is in terms of a device that nearly everyone has in their car. I certainly do. It's GPS. And the way in which the GPS system actually works is the fact that your unit has your GPS unit in your car has a clock in it. And right now, about 12,000 miles above us, there are 24 satellites in geosynchronous orbits. That is to say, they cover particular places on the Earth at any given time. And these satellites have clocks on them. And the way in which the GPS system works is that at a certain time, a signal is sent from one of these satellites to your unit. Actually, 3 of these satellites send the signal to your unit. And your unit reaches that signal at a certain time. And if you know the time that the signal was sent and the time that it was received by your unit, you know the speed of the signal, the speed of light, distance. Anytime you know speed and you know time, you can compute distance. So that's the way in which your unit works. Unfortunately, when the system was set up, it wasn't working right. It was giving incorrect locations. And the reason for that was the fact that they had forgotten to take into account Einstein's theory of gravity, which says that the clock in your unit is actually running slower than those clocks on board the satellites. And that means that the clocks are getting out of sync. So they actually have to use Einstein's theory, and they actually use computers to take into account that difference in the rate at which time the clocks are moving. And that actually corrected the problem. That is to say, by taking into account the fact that the clocks on the satellites are running faster than the clocks in your unit, they were able to work, and that's why it works. So we do know that time is affected by gravity, and that turns out to be the key also eventually of time travel into the past. Now, I've covered an enormous amount, and I don't know, that probably overlaps with some of your other questions, but let me pause here and let you, catch up.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I am so fascinated by this stuff. I love it. I'm on the edge of my seat. Okay, well, we can okay, yep. Next question then is how would your proposed idea for a time machine work?
Okay. Well, as I said, my work is actually connected with Einstein's general theory of relativity, which, as I said, has to do with time being affected by gravity. And it turns out that my work involves the fact that in normal classical physics of Newton, the only thing that can create gravity is matter. For example, the Earth creates a gravitational field that keeps us anchored. The Sun creates a gravitational field which keeps the Earth in orbit, and so on. The thing is that in Einstein's theory, not only can matter create gravity, but light can create gravity as well. And the way in which my work, or I should say the breakthrough of my work, was to realize that if gravity can affect time and light can create gravity, then light can affect time. In other words, you could actually use light of a particular type to affect gravity. And it turns out that the type of light that you have to use is a laser beam, because lasers can be focused into a narrow beam. And what I realized is that this lasers can actually create a gravitational field that can actually alter time. And one of the things that I found out with my calculations, and I should mention once again that, like Einstein, I'm a theoretical physicist. What I did was to use equations. Essentially, my work is based on Einstein's gravitational equations, and what I did was to solve those equations for a particular type of light. That what I was able to show is that time, if you have a circulating light beam, and you can create a circulating light beam in a number of different ways. You can actually have light bounce off of mirrors. That's one way of creating a circulating light beam. But it turns out that if you have a circulating light beam, you can create a particular type of gravitational field that actually can cause the twisting of space and time. And normally, time travel, normally all of us move along a timeline from the past to the present to the future. And it's a linear line that goes from our birth to our death along that line. However, if we twist time into a loop, then we could actually twist that timeline in such a way that we go from the past to the present to the future. Since we've made the timeline into a loop, we can go from the future back into the past. So by using a circulating light beam, what I was able to do was to show that you can create a twisting gravitational field. Essentially, you can twist time into a loop, and along that loop in time, you could go back to the past. So that's essentially what my device, and when I say that, once again, as I said, all of this is based on mathematical equations that I've solved that shows this. The thing is that what has to be done is, just as in the case of Einstein's earlier theories, experiments have to be done. But in physics, experiments are extremely expensive. People don't realize that. They see these things in the movie, and they think that that's the way things work in real life. In other words, they see someone, and I should mention that one of my favorite movies is Back to the Future, but real life is nothing like that. You cannot go in your garage and create anything that has to do with real physics. The thing is that the type of experiments that are going to be needed, just the startup costs for the type of work that I'm doing, is going to be about $250,000, and that's cheap, by the way. I should mention that the Large Hadron Collider that I was mentioning earlier, its whole purpose is just accelerating subatomic particles. That experiment costs on the order of $10 billion. So real experiments are extremely expensive. And the stage that we're at right now is I have an experimental partner who's a specialist in lasers, and we're at the stage of trying to get the funding that's necessary to do these experiments. And that is that's a challenge to try to get the funding. But the physics is solid. The physics says the equations say that by using circulating light beam, you can twist space, and eventually you can twist time. And if you can twist time, then you can travel back into the past. So we have, you might say, to use an analogy with the movie business, having a script is one thing, getting the movie made is another. And so right now we're at the stage of having the script, but trying to get the funding to get the movie, to get the device made is time. And that's where we're at.
Wow. Do you have any kind of timeline on how close you might be to developing an experimental prototype?
When you say a timeline, that's no pun intended. But the point that no, it depends on funding. I mean, if we get funding, then I'll be able to develop a timeline. But there's no timeline without having the funding. It's like it would be like you saying to someone, as I said, using the movie analogy. If I have the script and you would say, well, how long is it going to take you to make the movie? Well, I can't make the movie until I get the money to make the movie. So having the script is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And so I have the equations and the physics there, but until we get the funding, it's not possible to talk about timeline. Now, I could say that suppose that we got the adequate funding. If we got the adequate funding, then it would probably take just initial phases would probably take about 5 years to develop the first basic aspects, which show that we can twist space, circulating light. But then to twist time is going to require many, many millions of dollars beyond that. So let's suppose that we got all the funding that we need. Probably we're talking about on the order of 10 years if we got all the funding. But we don't have anywhere near the funding, so there's no timeline yet until we get the funding.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like a lot. It sounds like an uphill battle, but how could communication between 2 points in time work with your idea for this machine?
Well, the thing is that what you could do is you could send information back, and I should mention that the work that I'm doing, we're not trying to send people back in time. We're looking at trying to show that we can send subatomic particles and information back. And in some ways, sending information back is more important than sending people back, because the thing is that information, we are in the information age, by the way, and sending information back could lead to, in fact, people have asked me, what would be one of the uses that you would have. And one of the uses for me would be as an early warning system. Imagine you had a way of sending information back to the past that could warn you of things like tsunamis and earthquakes, hurricanes, the thousands of lives you could save. And the way in which you could send information back would be by using subatomic particles. You could use neutrons, for example, to send information back. It turns out that a neutron spins like a little top, and it only has two particular directions to spin. It can spin up or it can spin down. And so the thing is that what you could do is you could assign a 1 to the spin up direction, and you could assign a 0 to the spin down direction. And if you had a beam of neutrons, for instance, let's say that was spin up, spin down, that's 1, 1, 1 with 0. So what are you talking about? That's binary code. So by using the spin of neutrons, you could use that as binary code to send information back. And then in the past, you would have to have a device there to decode the spins to tell you so that you could translate the information into information that we could use. But that would be the way in which you would do it.
Wow. I'm sure you've had your fair share of skeptics and people trying to, poke holes and stuff like that. What are some of the paradoxes that might come up in sending messages back in time?
Well, the thing is that, of course, one of the main paradoxes that come up has to do with what's known as the grandfather paradox. And usually people think about it in terms of sending a person back. So suppose you send someone back. Suppose you went back in time and somehow you prevented your grandparents from meeting each other. So if you prevent your grandparents from meeting each other, then they don't have your parents. And if they don't have your parents, then your parents don't have you. So how did you go back? Since you would cease to exist, how would you go back to prevent your grandparents from meeting each other? That's called the grandfather paradox, where you do something that could potentially seem as though it could erase your own existence. And that's a serious problem as far as going back into the past. You don't have that problem if you're going into the future, but you do have that problem if you're going back to the past. And however, it turns out that physics itself says that there might be a way out of that particular paradox. And this has to do with what's known as quantum physics. Relativity is only one of the pillars of modern physics. The other pillar of modern physics is quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics is a very different animal, I should mention, from relativity. Quantum mechanics has to do with how matter and energy behave, how the atom essentially behaves. Quantum mechanics underlies all of our modern technology. Our PCs, our cell phones, all of these things depend on quantum mechanics. In fact, our whole understanding of the elements in the periodic table depend on our understanding of quantum mechanics. But the thing is that quantum mechanics does not predict things with certainty. Unlike classical physics, where you could actually make definite, certain predictions, you can't do that in quantum mechanics. All you can do is talk about the probability of something happening. And this leads to some interesting effects of quantum mechanics. In fact, it leads to a whole new notion called parallel universes. And the idea behind parallel universe has to do with something that was developed by a physicist named Hugh Everett back in 1957 at Princeton. What he did was to apply quantum mechanics to the universe as a whole. And what he found as a result of that was the fact that whenever an event, there's a possibility of two outcomes to an event, then what can happen is that both outcomes can occur, but in different universes. Now, let me give you a simple example that I use, and I actually mention this in my book. Let's suppose that today you were trying to decide between having a fish sandwich and a cheeseburger. At the moment that you chose the fish sandwich, there would be a split of the universe. It would now be a Josh Peck in a separate universe that has chosen the cheeseburger. So the you in the universe that chose the fish sandwich is separate from the you that chose, and they're both real, but they're now in two separate universes. This happens for every single possible decision that you and everyone else make. If there's more than one outcome, then both outcomes occur, but they occur in different universes. Now, it's mind-boggling because this means that there's an infinite number of these parallel universes that are branching off all the time. And it doesn't have to do with human consciousness. It's something that has to do with the way in which the world works. In other words, if an electron has a possibility of taking one path or another, it takes both paths, but in separate universes. So this is called the parallel universe notion, where all of these outcomes are occurring, but in different universes. And it was a physicist named David Deutsch who applied this to time travel. And what he found was that when you go back into the past, there is as soon as you arrive in the past, there's a split, and that you arrive in a parallel universe. And in that universe, you actually could prevent your grandparents in that universe from meeting each other. That you would just now find yourself locked into a strange universe in which you were never born in. You would still be there. However, remember I said there was a split. The other universe, you don't arrive in that universe when you get to the past. That universe is the one that leads to you. In other words, since you don't arrive in that universe, your grandparents meet each other, have your parents, and eventually your parents have you. So what the upshot is that it says that time travel to the past is possible, but the past you arrive in is not the past that you came from. So there is no paradox. And that is one of the ways in which people, many physicists, and I'm one of them, believe that the grandfather paradox may be resolved. But that's only one possibility. There's others. One of them, the other ones, is the fact that when you go back into the past, you do something that actually you can't really alter the past. Whatever you try to do in the past is something will prevent you from actually altering it. So that no matter how you try to change the outcome, the simplest example would be, suppose that you're determined that you're going to prevent your grandparents from meeting each other. But when you arrive at the past, you break your leg, so you can't go and do that. So that's a very simple example. But the point is that essentially what this other alternative says is that when you try to go back into the past, something happens to prevent you from being alter the past. Those are the possibilities, and but which one actually occurs, we don't know. We won't know until we actually do the experiment. It may turn out that we really do, in some way, really alter the past, and the past that we think we're living is a past that's actually, even though it seems like it's real to us, is actually a past that's been tampered with by a time traveler. But as I said, we won't know until we actually do the experiment which one of these play out. But the parallel universe is one of the favorite ones as far as getting around this notion of a paradox.
Wow, that is so fascinating. I in my book I touch a little bit on the parallel universe or many worlds interpretation, and what I try to show is if that does prove to be true, it doesn't necessarily have to be a threat to faith or anything, because a lot of people have theological problems with that, and they say if there's other me's out there, how does that affect free will, or do we share a soul, and that kind of stuff. And I just put in the book, if that turns out to be true, it just means that God's creation is a lot bigger than we thought. You wouldn't share a soul with that person. You have your own soul, and you're only responsible for your own choices. So it would just be like having another, because we're just talking about physical things here. There's only a certain amount of ways that particles can arrange themselves and stuff like that. So I try to show in the book how it's not necessarily a theological problem. It's something that might be a scientific possibility, and that shouldn't scare somebody away from, if they're interested, from the study of quantum physics and quantum mechanics and stuff, because it's so interesting.
Well, I like the way in which you stated it, which is the fact that what it just simply shows is that God's universe is much greater and much bigger than we thought. That's all it means. And that it doesn't mean that, and you're right, all of these other yous have their own soul and their own responsibility. So that's a very good way of putting it, I think.
Good deal. Yeah, that's how I try to reconcile it in the book, because it's funny, but I find that most Christians that have a problem with science or physics in particular, it 9 times out of 10 it comes back to that, the parallel universe thing. I think that's so strange, because it seems like such an obscure thing to let stand in someone's way, but nevertheless it's there. So yeah, I wanted to put that in the book, and so I think that's cool that we're we're talking about this too. Do you have any concerns of any type of possibility that this technology could be misused in some way?
Oh, of course. I mean, the thing is however, and this is important, is the fact that any technology can be misused. One simple example that I like to use that actually was mentioned to me by my stepson during a conversation that we were having with other people. And what he did was to pick up a butter knife, and he said, "This is technology, and I can use this to butter my bread, but someone could also use this knife to stab someone." And that's technology. So are we going to ban butter knives? So the thing is that, we have to realize that whatever we create has both positive and negative possibilities associated with it. And it's up to us. And that's why we have laws that regulate things. I mean, air travel is something that is very much regulated. And it's going to be the same when it comes to time travel. It's going to happen. But the thing is that we're going to have to make sure it's regulated. And that's why it's important for people to realize that these possibilities are out there so they can begin to think about, how are we going to deal with it? Because we are going to have to deal with it. I mean, the thing is that, and this is another thing that's a bit frustrating for me, is the fact that, unfortunately, in this country, we have a tendency to do things in a reactionary way. And what I mean by that is the fact that we do things technologically sometimes because we're afraid of it being done by someone else. To give the simplest example of that is the Sputnik. I mean, we had the technology to send the satellite into space long before the Russians did. However, it wasn't until they sent the satellite in space that all of a sudden, we were in a space race. And, it's as I said, if the next, let's suppose that the CIA tomorrow uncovered the fact that North Korea was doing research on time travel, well, I would have more funding that I could know what to do with.
Yeah, very true.
But the thing is that we shouldn't wait to see what's going to happen somewhere else before we decide to actually look at these things ourselves and to start thinking about how it is that we're going to have to deal with it. But yes, there is a possibility of misuse, but that is not going to stop the technology just simply because of the fact that we don't want it, because of the fact that it's possible that it has a negative connotations to it. What we're going to have to do is to say, well, okay, how are we going to regulate this, and how are we going to make the maximum use of this for the good?
Very well said. I couldn't agree more with you there. Is it possible that once you let's say that you got all the funding that you needed and you were able to build a working machine, is it possible that once you turn on the machine, messages from the future will immediately start presenting themselves?
No, not necessarily, because the thing is, you have to remember that you can't, things can't just simply happen. You have to have a receiver, and that receiver has to be tuned to whatever it is that you expect to get. Remember I said, for example, that coded messages could be sent back in binary code using neutron spins. Well, that would mean what you would have to do is you would have to set up with your device, you would have to have detectors that were set up to receive the specific type of information that you were planning on sending from the future. So your experiment would have to be designed with the future possibility in mind of what it is that you're sending back. So you're not going to get anything unless you've designed the experiment to receive something that you specifically are going to design at a later date to send information back. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So if you had the machine and you had the detectors, you had everything running, and how would you go about knowing when, like, let's say you wanted to send a message back, like, okay, yeah, you have the machine running and the detectors and everything, and because if I understand right, you have to have the machine. You can't go back like 100 years. You can only go back as far as the machine and detectors have been turned on. Is that correct?
Quite correct. Yeah. Well, the thing is that the first type of experiments that we would do aren't going to be so dramatic as getting a message, something like Alexander Graham Bell got, when they set up the telephone. What it'll be is something much more prosaic. Where it turns out that there are subatomic particles that I mentioned before can only live for a very short period of time, and then they completely disintegrate. Okay, Now, the thing is that what we would do is to send a beam of those particles into the region where we believe we've twisted time. Now, normally, some of these particles are going to get whipped around, and they're going to live longer than they normally would. That's an effect we would expect to see if they're traveling fast. But now, some of those particles that go back in time, if they go back just a little bit and come forward, those particles will actually live less than they normally would. So we would actually get a distribution by sending in a set of identical particles that decay within a certain time normally, okay? And we see a distribution in which some of these particles are living longer than they should, and some of those particles are living shorter than they should. The ones that are living shorter than they should would actually show us that these particles have been sent into the past. That's the way in which we would first look at it.
Oh, okay. That's really interesting. So it sounds like even with a working prototype, we're still quite a ways away from being able to send actual messages back.
Yeah. No, I mean, and once again, this is real physics, and it would be in stages. But that would be the way in which we would initially know that we've actually have sent something back, even just a little bit. But once we've been able to do that just a little bit, then we'll be able to bootstrap that, and that will allow us to be able to eventually design something much more sophisticated. And that's the way in which it happens in physics. Like, if you read about the history of the lasers, is a great example. Einstein, once again, when the public doesn't generally realize this, but Einstein actually developed the theoretical equations for the possibility of a laser back in 1917. It wasn't until the 60s that technology caught up, and it was very, very difficult to produce a laser, extremely difficult. But once they were able to produce the simplest laser, then all of a sudden things exploded. We actually then realized that we could get practically anything to laze. So if that's the sort of thing that happens with technology, once you're able to do it, even for the simplest case, then what happens is that there's an explosion of understanding, and then the development of it increases exponentially. But as I said, we're a long way from that because of the fact that we have to get baby step associated with this right now.
I had a couple hypothetical situations, and I mean, I know this is all just theory and speculation at this point when we're talking about hypotheticals, but it was something I was thinking about earlier today, and I'm curious to get your opinion on it. So basically, with the idea of sending something back, there's either the many worlds interpretation, which would state that when a message or what have you goes back, it branches off into another universe where something different happens. And then there's the other, I don't know if it has a name, but the other interpretation where there's just our universe, and then you may or may not be able to change the past. So, like, hypothetically, let's say that the machine exists and it's sophisticated enough to be able to send messages back in time, and we have all the detectors and everything that we would need for that. Let's say you turn on the machine and detectors and everything, and you leave it alone for a week. Then you decide to send a message back 1 week to the time that you turn the machine on. Now, if there's only one universe, then it would seem once you send a message back, you would actually remember receiving the message a week ago. In essence, the original timeline when you received no message would be erased and replaced with a timeline in which you had. In that instance, there would be some evidence of the success of the machine. You would have no recollection of turning on the machine and receiving no message. For you, you would have turned the machine on and immediately received a message. So there would be direct evidence that the machine does in fact work. But if there are parallel universes, the message would get sent back 1 week, and you would receive it, yet that would branch off into a new universe. But where does that leave you in the original universe? From your original perspective, you would send a message back, it would disappear, and absolutely nothing would have changed. It would seem that if you turn on the machine and start receiving messages, once it's developed enough for that to happen, it could maybe provide evidence contrary to many worlds. However, if you turn it on and receive nothing immediately, it might provide evidence supporting many worlds. So my question is, if the many worlds interpretation is correct, and you send a message back that creates a branch into a parallel universe, how would you ever be able to know that the machine had in fact worked and not just displaced the message or somewhere else or destroyed it altogether?
Yeah, well, there's going to be an uncertainty in that. I mean, the thing is that when you send the message, if you turn on the machine and you have it set up so that it could detect things, and it detects something, okay? But let's suppose that the message that it detects says, in essence, a week from now you're going to send particles back, okay? Mm-hmm. And that's the message that you got. Now let's suppose that a week from now you are perverse and say, oh, I'm not going to send anything back. So how is it that I got something back there? Well, the thing is that it could be, that would be actually be saying that there's probably a parallel universe because you got something, you see? Mm-hmm. If you do send it, then that actually could tell you that, well, this is the universe that I sent it from, is my own universe. So in a sense, if you get something and you decide not to send something, then that could be evidence of the parallel universe. If you get something and you do decide to send something, then that could be evidence of the fact that you actually did it within your own universe.
One of the more attractive things about this possibility is something you touched on earlier. It would seem this type of technology could be used to prevent tragedies, like, for example, 9/11. And this kind of this is a bit similar to the first hypothetical, but let's say your machine existed at the time of 9/11, and 9/11 happens, and you send a message back to prevent it, and let's say they receive it in the past, and they are actually able to prevent it. It seems this could lead to one of two outcomes. Either preventing it would cause a branch to another universe, in which case we would still be living in the universe in which 9/11 happened, essentially preventing nothing in our own universe. Or it would change the past in our own universe, therefore creating a reality in which the message would never be sent back in the first place. No 9/11, no message, and with no message would come no prevention, in which case we would be back where we started from in a timeline in which 9/11...
What it would simply mean is that reality is much more plastic than we thought, because we actually really did change our universe, and so the universe that sent this back, or our universe, actually no longer exists. In other words, the universe now that you think that you're living in really isn't as solid as you think it is, and that's a scarier possibility, but that's a possibility.
Wow. That's so cool. Yeah, and you pretty much answered the question I was getting to. I was the question was going to be, are these limitations valid, and if so, is there any way around them to actually be able to change the past in a way that we can all experience? And yeah, I think you just answered that. it would seem even if there were limitations or what have you, it would seem at least it could be used to save lives during natural disasters, like you pointed out, because we can't prevent a hurricane, but even if we knew about it ahead of time, but we could warn people and save lives. So either way, the hurricane is going to happen, so there will always be a reason to send back the message. So unless many worlds is true and we send something back and don't get to experience the changes, there's at least one way we can use the machine, like a machine like this, to improve things in a tangible way. What are some other applications for a machine like the one that you propose?
Well, to me, if one were able to do this, and one of the things that I mentioned in my book, which is really fairly far out, but not so far out as one might think, is the fact that it's very likely there are now what physicists and astrophysicists call extrasolar planets. These are actually planets that are orbiting other suns. It wasn't known until the 90s. It had been speculated that these might exist, but it wasn't known until the 90s that there could actually be other solar systems like ours. And it turns out that there is highly likely, not only is it likely, we've actually seen other systems. It turns out that some of these planets are too close to their suns to inhabit any kind of a life. Some of them are too far away. They might have an exotic form of life, but it would be very strange. But there are some planets that are just in the right zone. In fact, the name of these planets have been given by physicists, which gives you an indication of the nature of the planet, is they're called Goldilocks planets. In other words, these are the planets that are just right. And these planets, some of them may support life forms that are very much more advanced than ours, that have been there for very much longer than we have. And so it turns out that they may have developed time travel much earlier than we have. If we encounter these civilizations eventually, we could use their devices, which have the same limitation, but suppose that they had turned on their devices 10,000 years ago. When we find these, we could visit our distant past as well, using their technology. The thing is that to me, that would be exciting because that would open up our distant past for, to see history. And to actually, imagine what it'd be like, at least to me, to actually be able to see ancient Egypt and ancient Rome. So the thing is that to me, visiting the past just to see what the past was really like, to me, would be one of the other really exciting things. But it won't be possible with our type of, terrestrial technology, because right now we haven't invented it. But as I said, once again, even though it sounds a bit far out, it's not beyond the possibility that eventually we'll encounter extraterrestrial civilizations. This doesn't have anything to do with UFOs, by the way. But terrestrial civilizations which actually have had time travel, and we could use it to visit our ancient past. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that our distant past may eventually become open to us when we've developed the space technology that's necessary to travel to other planets.
Wow. That's definitely interesting. That for me could easily go into a whole other line of questioning, but I won't do that to you. But yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. You mentioned that you wrote a book entitled Time Traveler. Can you tell me about what readers can expect to find in your book?
Definitely, because the thing is that what I decided was to write a book that was not just going to be your typical popular science book. There's plenty of those out there. What I wanted to do was do something that would make it an interesting thing as a story. So the book is actually a combination memoir and popular science book. It actually follows my development, but it also follows my understanding of relativity and everything, so that people who are reading the book will actually gain an understanding. They'll learn a story, the story of my, development and why I became interested in my relationship with my father. So there's an interesting story there, but woven within that story is my increased understanding of relativity and quantum physics, and so people will actually grow and learn as I grow and learn in the book. First, they'll start out with sort of a rudimentary understanding, but then it gets more and more sophisticated. But it never goes into, becoming something that's beyond, the popular science level. So that's what people can expect. They can expect a blend of memoir and popular science, which will talk about, all of the things that they've heard about. Wormholes. I talk about cosmic strings and black holes, and I talk about other people's work as far as time travel is concerned. People, how they use wormholes as possible time machines, and how they use cosmic strings. So it covers all of these things, but it does it at a popular level. But as I said, it's embedded in a story. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the filmmaker, the award-winning filmmaker Spike Lee, became interested in it. He's actually had bought the rights for this earlier, and he has written a script for a feature film, and it's actually going to be a regular feature film like one finds in the theaters about my story and my work, and so this is for that reason. Incidentally, if you ever get a chance, one of the other programs that I really think that both you and your wife would enjoy, in fact, it's the one that made my work come to Spike Lee's attention, was by This American Life. They had a radio program a few years ago, and which they focused on my work. It was called My Brilliant Plan, and it's been considered one of their most popular episodes of This American Life. So you might like to hear that sometime. But that's what people can expect in the book. They can expect a memoir plus popular science that talks about the real scientific possibility of time travel.
Fantastic. Yeah, that sounds like it would make an excellent movie. I think Spike Lee made a good choice there. Is there a release date set or a timeline or anything of when people could expect to see?
That's the reason why I used that earlier example for you of having the script.
Oh.
But then getting the movie made. And the thing is that what has to happen is the studio now has to pick up the option on the script, and that requires getting the money, in other words, to make the film. So right now it's just at the script stage, but that in itself is an advance, but still it's not in the stage of being made into a film yet without the budget.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, I'm definitely going to be looking forward to that, and I'll keep my eyes out open for it too. If people want to know more about you and your work or order your book, where can they go?
Oh, yes, there we go. The best place as far as people, if people were interested in learning about getting the book, I would recommend is Amazon.com, because, as I said, it's very inexpensive, and that's where I send people to. Actually, it's in local bookstores as well. I mean, Barnes & Noble carries it, but as I said, I suggest people going to Amazon.com. Paperback. As far as learning more about my work, they can go to the University of Connecticut website, which is www.uconn, and that's UCONN.edu. Go there, then they can faculty. They'll find me. And that's they can find it. The other way they can if they wish is they can also contact me via Facebook. In other words, if they just put in a Facebook friend request, I'll be happy to add them to my Facebook.
All right, that was Dr. Ronald Mallett. A very big thank you goes out to Dr. Mallett for taking the time to speak with me and give me an interview for my book. Absolutely fantastic phenomenal topic. I mean, there's so many different avenues that we could look at and go down, and it's really cool to hear not only what a physicist has to say about it, but what a Christian physicist has to say about it. So that was definitely cool. So again, big thank you to Dr. Mallett. Make sure to check out his book Time Traveler, and thank you all for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe. And keep checking back for more videos. So all that being said, thank you for watching, take care, and God bless.